Hello, you're listening to The Sower, a podcast of the Ciceronian Society. The Ciceronian Society exists to equip and encourage Christian scholars as they serve the church, because we believe the church is, or should be, the center of cultural and civic renewal. To learn more about us, our events, our journal Pietas, to sign up for our newsletter and make your tax-deductible gift, please go to ciceroniansociety.org. We have a really busy year ahead, so definitely stay tuned. We got our fall symposium this October 22nd to the 24th in Holland, Michigan. And a tentative program for that is now available. Sponsorships are also open, registrations open. Our spring 2027 conference will be at Regent University in Virginia Beach, March 11th through the 13th, and the proposals for that are due September 1st. We'll also be launching, or we have launched, I should say, the Logres Institute for Classical Studies. Courses and applications for enrollment are now available, and enrollment for the first semester of courses starts October 2026, and we'll keep that going in 2027 if you're interested in that. I'm Josh Bowman, Executive Director of the Ciceronian Society. Before we go any further, I'd like to open with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we ask that in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, you would bless this conversation and guide us by your Holy Spirit. May all we say and do bring glory and honor to you. Amen. Well, today I'm very excited to be joined by my good friend Ben Peterson. Ben is an assistant professor in the Department of Government and Criminal Justice at Abilene Christian University in Texas. He has written for a variety of outlets such as Law and Liberty, Comment, Public Discourse, and National Affairs. He lives in Oklahoma City with his wife, and he's also a member of the Ciceronian Society's Board of Directors. Viewers and listeners will also recognize him from our other show, discussing Cicero's On Duties, which airs every Wednesday morning. Ben has been on a handful of episodes of those recently, and I'm sure he'll be on more. Today, we're discussing his new book, Community, Character, and the Governance of the Social Commons, Sanctuaries of Order, published by Bloomsbury Press. That's such a academic title. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you very much, Josh. It's fantastic to be here on the Sower. Thanks for the invitation. And yes, you know, the academic titles, right? It's can we make it any longer, right? Is always the goal.
Every year when we're doing the program for the spring conference, the number of just long titles that I have to cut. I want everyone listening to me right now. It doesn't have to be that long. It doesn't. Just give it, make the title like a little tease. Okay. Yeah. Now this is okay in a book. You got to publish it. Was this your dissertation? I forgot to ask you that.
No, this wasn't my dissertation. This was a separate kind of project. Although I also need to give credit to one of the reviewers for the book suggested the title Sanctuaries of Order. Which I really liked and thought fit was what I was trying to do. I actually originally, I was thinking, that should be the title, but the editors wanted a more descriptive title, so I deferred.
You never know. Yeah, you never know. It got published. That's what you got to do. Exactly. All right. Well, now this new book, a lot of themes overlap with Ciceronian Society. I mean, it reminds me of why you're on our board and why you're helping us do what we do. And your book is confronting a rather massive set of problems that are not easily articulated, but essentially, if I'm reading this correctly, Americans just no longer seem willing or maybe even able to govern themselves. Is that the gist of your diagnosis? Am I overstating that? That's a pretty bold claim.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, that is definitely the gist of my diagnosis. As you point out, I mean, I'm talking here, we can get into some specifics in a minute, but I am talking about kind of a number of disparate phenomena that really do deserve their own individual analysis, right? But and maybe this is just how I tend to think. I'm sort of trying to think in terms of what's the common factor here. Is there some way of understanding these different? I'm thinking about everything from things like loneliness, things like the failure, or the decline of family formation, things like public disorder, crime where it persists, drug overdose, deaths of despair. All these I think of it almost. In this book, I sort of think of this as a syndrome of a decline, a problem of order. Mm-hmm. A decline in our ability to govern ourselves and in how we maintain order. There's a quote I begin with, which is I thought was a very provocative quotation from a speech by a man named David Brown in 2016. He was then police chief of Dallas, and he gave this very interesting speech after I believe a sniper shot a number of police officers in Dallas, and he was responding to this terrible event. And he made some really interesting comments in that speech where he said that we as a society are putting way too much on the police to deal with. Right, the way we're trying to solve social problems like mental health, like poor education, like family breakdown, is we're essentially not coming up with ways to solve these problems through other social mechanisms, so we're sort of sloughing them off onto the police. I'm paraphrasing that quotation, and mostly that's been picked up by the thinkers that are on the left, as you can imagine, and take it as a kind of, well, we need to defund the police or completely rearrange our society. But I thought, there's a kind of conservative perspective on this that I think can begin from that insight as well. And so that's kind of partly what I was trying to do. So I look at all these different things, and I'm trying to draw them together and diagnose them as a problem of order, sort of both at the societal level and ultimately at the personal level as well.
Well, yeah, and one of the, just listening to you talk about that, first of all, one of the first things that came to mind, you're going to laugh at this, is there's a short episode of Bluey where, have you ever seen Bluey? We're both wearing blue. Okay. So Bluey is the world's greatest children's cartoon. And there's this one episode where Bandit, the dad, is frustrated with his kids, and he pretends he's writing a letter to the government to solve his problems. Like, basically, why don't there be a law? You should be doing more to make my kid. And the whole premise of the show is like, look, the government's not here to solve every problem. But that's part of the problem that we have today in America in particular, is every time we rightly see disorder, we immediately think, well, there ought to be a law, there ought to be a policy, there ought to be, I'm going to sue you, right? We immediately go for that level of resolution, or the way to fix this is through an election, even. I mean, are you saying that's not what we should do? And I'm wondering, I guess we can get into the kind of prescription later. So let's stick with the diagnosis. You've already hinted at some things when it comes to drugs, loneliness, deaths of despair, things like that. What are some implications of this lack of self-government? What are some of the things when you looked at this, rather than just getting a vibe, if you will, right? What are some of the empirical evidence that this disorder is happening, that there is this breakdown in self-government?
Yes. So, and to add a little bit to, there's some nuance to be had there. I mean, I start with in this kind of diagnosis chapter of the book. I start with the most sort of obvious and indicator of sort of social and or personal disorder would be crime, right? That's kind of the most sort of direct breach of social order might be things like homicide, murder, robbery, things like this. And actually, I mean, we're having sort of, some people are arguing we're having record low levels actually of crime right now. Actually, but maybe contrary to popular belief, we actually have had a significant crime decline since the 90s, since the early 1990s, with some, blips, especially in 2020 to 21 or 2020 to 2021.
Right.
However, if you look at our, let's say our some indicators like our incarceration rate, or it's even declined some. But if you compare our level of crime and let's say incarceration, or the criminal justice sort of footprint of the criminal justice system more generally, compared to say 1925, 100 years ago or something like that, you'd have roughly the same level of crime, albeit we don't have as great of data for that time period, but you'd have roughly the same level of, say, murder, maybe even a little higher. But our level of criminal justice, sort of the footprint in society, our incarceration rate is still maybe 4 or 5 times as high as it was then, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, for roughly something similar of a level of sort of social order in terms of just like the most extreme breach of social order, we are achieving that at a much higher cost in terms of our criminal justice footprint. That would be sort of one example that I try to argue. we mentioned uh, drug overdose, right? And I don't remember the exact numbers right now, but since the early 90s, we saw a dramatic rise in drug overdose rates. That's received a lot of attention from a variety of scholars and commentators. And now there certainly there's supply questions of like legal changes that might have led to supply of different kinds of narcotics and things like that. There's enforcement that may play a role in that. But I sort of want to highlight at the end of the day, that's also an issue of personal choices, personal behavior that is leading to, again, a much higher level of drug overdose and drug abuse than you would have seen in, say, the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, right? And so part of so those are some of the kinds of indicators. Loneliness, we talked about. The Surgeon General a few years ago, I think under the tail end of the Biden administration, put out a report about the crisis of reported loneliness, right? The number of people who say, I don't have any close friends, right? I don't have any close relationships that I can tell people about has been rising. There's some great reports by scholars like Daniel Cox. They've done some really good analysis of this kind of thing about the level of community participation. Robert Putnam is a touchstone work in his work Bowling Alone and subsequent works where he sort of launched this discussion of the decline of what a lot of social scientists call social capital since roughly 1965, 64, 65. And that's measured in terms of participation in local community organizations, church participation, and attendance. All of these things, I think, are partly indicators of what I'm talking about. And just to kind of, I'll stop in just a second. But again, one of the things I kind of want us to step back, I'm inviting people to step back and think about a little bit, is to compare, our social experience with maybe 100 years ago. If you look at, 1920, 1925, even into the early era of the Depression, just how dramatically different our social experience would be, right? The level of divorce that people are familiar with, the lack of family formation that we're seeing, or the declines, unequal to be sure, but I think it would just be a very different social experience, even though, we were at in some ways, a much higher level of material prosperity than that time period. So all of those things are sort of partly what leads me it draws me to this conclusion.
Well, it kind of gets back to, Seth Kaplan comes to mind here, right? So his whole notion of fragile neighborhoods is showing how, look, in the United States, we experience a kind of social poverty, if you will, that does not make sense if material wealth solves everything, right?
Right.
We have this extraordinary material wealth that does not correlate to actual happipiness and well-being. We're more obese. I say that as a contributing factor here. We're also, the drugs, we're lonely, the lack of fathers in homes, right? That's a huge crisis. A huge number of people are either underemployed or they have just stopped looking for work. I mean, that Nick Eberstadt has cataloged that particular issue. What's going on there? Is it just, I'm not going to preempt his diagnosis there, but I think it's really interesting to look. And we've actually seen how, prior to COVID-19, he had his book out, and I can't remember, I think it's just called Men Out of Work.
Yeah.
Right. Where he's showing that men are at an unprecedented rate of underemployment or unemployment, where they're not even looking for work, right? They're not even being factored in to the unemployment numbers. And now post COVID, it has only gotten worse, and it's actually extended more to women as well. There's just not the work out there for people, and the numbers that are most reported don't really get at what's actually happening. And I think you get this sense of, we're not all right. And the other thing too that struck me as you were talking, thinking about this, coming up to the midterms this fall, one of the things I've noticed in some of the campaign rhetoric on both sides is, rather than cast a vision of hope for the future, your strategy as a candidate is to say, I'm mad about the same things you are. I'm frustrated by these things. I'm more angry than them, and I'm essentially you're identifying with people's rage and discontent more than with their hopes, right? Now, it doesn't mean that we need to suddenly paint some rosy picture that everything's okay, right? I think there's something to that, but it just shows how there's this huge shift in how we think of ourselves as a country, right? It's the decline narrative is more dominant than the hope narrative, if you will.
Yes.
Go ahead. You're gonna say something?
Well, just you mentioned, a few minutes ago, I think a lot of people are aware of a lot of these problems, right? I mean, this is receiving a lot of. I'm not necessarily saying anything new with highlighting these problems, and to your point, people like Eversted and others have analyzed some of these problems in great detail, but I do think that we do tend to kind of want to look for some sort of policy lever or political lever or civil political lever if we can get the right people into power, if we can just make this kind of a policy fix. And I definitely don't want to dissuade people from looking for legal and policy levers that can be adjusted such that incentives are properly arranged. And I think that's right. But I do think the degree of the issue is such, and the character of the issue of these kind of issues is such that we do need to look to this. You talked about a kind of a shift. It's almost as if the ground has shifted under our feet. That's an image that came to me. I was trying to think about this a few weeks ago. It's almost as if the social ground under us has shifted. And I also want to highlight. So let me. I began the preface of my book with a story about my great-great-grandfather. And when he was a teenager, his father said to him in no uncertain terms, son, if you ever are found publicly drunk, or if you impregnate a young lady outside of wedlock, just don't come home, right? Like, you are no longer welcome as part of this family, right? That sounds really harsh, and maybe it is too harsh, right? But guess what? My great-grandfather was a really stand-up person, right? I mean, he lived his life in a way that met and far exceeded those expectations. He internalized what I think the heart behind those sort of stern words was. And I don't know what his relationship with his father was like. Maybe it was terribly toxic. I don't know. But he was a believer who participated in faith, family, and community. He did his work. He studied the Bible. He was an church elder. And again, I'm not saying he was an angel or perfect, but I don't think he was that uncommon. I mean, that's kind of part of what I want to suggest is that I think he just understood the expectations that were placed on him in a much more stern way than I can even imagine having expectations placed on me or others around me. And yet I think there was a sense in which he internalized them, and he lived a very faithful and productive and a well-lived life, right? In a way that I think is possible, right? And I think we've kind of lost a sense of what's possible if we can maybe somehow shift our mindset to some degree in that direction.
Well, I can relate to this on a lot of levels, in the sense that when I try to explain my kids' social situation or experience to my parents or to my grandparents, I only have one grandparent left, and it requires a significant amount of translation, right? Like it would be very, very hard for the person who is experiencing society 100 years ago to even fathom what's going on today, right? There's the technological changes, the cultural and social changes, the political changes, all that. And I think that there's something to that. What have we lost in that process? But I mean, are you just being nostalgic? Is this just go back to the good old days? Like, hey, boomer, why don't we just go back to when everything was perfect, right? Pull yourself up from your bootstraps and go back to the 1950s when it was great. My guess is you're not saying that. So how are you balancing the kind of nostalgia with an honest, like, look, things have changed and not all for the better?
Yes, yeah, and I think that's a good. And I hear when you bring that potential criticism of my bringing that example up, and there's others I try to bring up in the book of situations where there have been in our own American history times and places where there was a high degree of just participation in faith, family, community in a way that I think was more conducive to contentment and social order. But you're right. I mean, I can hear Yuval Levin in my head. He's constantly criticizing conservatives in particular, and he's one of the best conservative thinkers. He's constantly criticizing us for being too nostalgic, right? And we need to think ahead. And I do take that point, and I want to avoid that. One of the things that I kind of want to point out, though, is that, again, back to the idea that we tend to think of these problems as outside of our control and beyond our grasp. And there's truth to that. I mean, there's, like you said, technological changes that we're all trying to grapple with. The latest only being the sort of, potential AI revolution, right? But there are things that are sort of larger and deal with social and or broader political forces and things like that. But I want to suggest that there's more that's in our grasp and within the zone of our agency than perhaps we're used to thinking about. Mm-hmm. And there are concrete, real historical examples, like the time period from the early to or the 1830s to the 1870s or mid 19th century. There were concrete efforts that we often characterize as sort of part of the Victorian era, right? That people saw around them, people and leaders in society saw around them problems of urbanization and problems associated with, the temptation of drugs and lack of decline in faith and things like that. And they made concerted efforts, not just from the top down, right? They made conservative efforts to make changes and to have civic organizations like the YMCA in its origin, right? That were designed to address these kinds of issues. And there's some social scientists like James Q. Wilson, who I draw on, Gertrude Himmelfarb, and others, who say there's reason to believe those had some success, right? They didn't create utopia on earth, right? But there have been times and places where people came together and were able to build collective capacity to actually transform the social environment for good, right? And I believe with God's help, and we can get into the role of the church, but I do think that we have to keep in mind that is possible. We shouldn't just another. I used part of what I'm trying to do in the book again is direct our attention to those kinds of ways of thinking about it, and the kinds of efforts that are not saying, hey, if we only had this one policy, or if we only had this new new government program, but that are say, hey, what could we as community members do together to try to encourage different habits where they're needed, right? To try to build social institutions that allow us to govern ourselves in a more effective way. Think about even how many of us have complained about, and I've done this and I'm complicit here, right? Like you said, how many of us complained about how, man, everybody's always on their phone. When I walk around a university campus, we're all just have our nose in our phone, right? But when I get a text, am I actually looking down, and as I'm walking along at the university, am I contributing to this sort of social norm developing? Sometimes the answer has been yes, right? And so there's so much that I think we're seeding at and attributing to things that are outside of our control, where they're actually well within our zone of agency.
Mm-hmm. And so in a way, this kind of gets to another question I had. Kind of the last question I want to ask about the diagnosis part is it, do you see the breakdown in self-government as being more of an elite-driven leadership, top-down issue, where essentially the ability of the masses, if you will, to govern themselves has been undermined by poor examples, poor leadership, or just outright hostility to institutions of governance, self-government? Or is it more of a the elites and the leaders have tried, but the masses just won't grow up? Right. And so we need to, the people just need to get in line and start figuring this out. I'm oversimplifying it dramatically, obviously, but did you find in that dichotomy there, did you find it more one way or the other? I mean, is that even a good way to look at it?
No, I mean, yeah, I think, I don't know that I have a straightforward answer. I mean, I definitely am trying to train the lens and focus more on the way you put it, kind of like a bottom up kind of, I don't know that we should just say, I mean, so thinkers like Charles Murray, who have documented some of these kind of phenomena, and especially, I mean, one point we should make, which complicates the whole diagnosis, is that these are definitely, there's a kind of class stratification to the problems we're talking about, family breakdown, and so I've kind of always been a little like Charles Murray, and I think now Rob Henderson is another writer who's dealing with some of these issues, psychologist. The idea that, hey, the elites need to preach what they practice, right? If you actually look at like behavioral norms among college educated, elites, they're closer to more of, Ozzie and Harriet kind of, kind of bourgeois norm kind of lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And so they need to, I don't know. I think there's something to that. I mean, I definitely think, I think all in all, it would be good for us as, those of us who are, in elite circles of whatever kind, to kind of champion some of what we've been talking about, sort of more of an embrace of faith, family, and community. And I think you do see elites that are doing that, but it doesn't quite, I mean, what's the mechanism by which the ideas at the top translate down to, so to speak, the broader public? I'm not sure that I have a clear sense of that, but I do think that there are probably, for instance, some incentives for, we talk about actually Vice President J.D. Vance in his book Hillbilly Elegy, kind of, and some of his later thinking and writing has talked about kind of the tendency for elites to kind of want to leave their communities of origin, and, people who might have been leaders in their communities and pillars in the social fabric might want to go be, investment brokers and have there. I think there's some of those kinds of incentives that, people have. So, I mean, but let me say one more thing about this. I mean, consider, for instance, one of the big topics that's of interest to, the whole, as part of the liberal post-liberalism debate, is this issue, the example of blue laws, right, and of Sabbath closing laws, right, that used to have that were widely evident in state law across the country, and have kind of mostly gone away. There's still some vestiges of them in some places where there's you can't sell alcohol until 11 a.m. or something like that on Sunday, right? But though that's an interesting example where I think it's sort of a little bit of an interplay, right? I mean, you definitely have elites that are interested in ending those kinds of legal frameworks, but I think you also have declining demand for those kinds of laws on the part of typical citizens, right? And you have greater interest in shopping, and there's a decline of religious faith and belief that I think is contributing to the possibility of those laws being passed. And I know there's some historians that have talked about that, right? So it's kind of a both and kind of thing. And I'll just the last thing I'll say by way of this unclear answer is that I do think there is. I mean, if you want to point to an elite phenomenon, some people are liable to say, a standard post-liberal analysis might be to say, well, it was John Locke, right? And it was the acceptance of individualism in our political theory and thought. I don't think that really works. But what I do think is that broadly, both at the elite level and then at the sort of more of a practical level in law and society, I think that where I think the post-liberals like Patrick Deneen are right, is that you can see the very broad influence starting in the 50s and 60s of a John Stuart Millian form of liberalism, which says, hey, as long as you're not harming somebody directly, right, the state and even the society has no business in, sort of trying to constrain or curtail your liberty, right? Your freedom of action. And I do think you can trace in a variety of settings some of the settings that David Brown in his speech that I opened with talks about: education, mental health care, and family law and family practice, just sort of family ethos. I think you can see the footprint of this Millian understanding of liberty that doesn't really account for this sort of the fact that we are incredibly social beings, that we are helping to shape the social environment around us in each of our actions, and even in the way we speak to each other, the way we organize ourselves together. So I do think that there is a kind of interplay between the elite level and the mass level that I'm not sure I have an answer in terms of which one is it one or the other, right? I think there's a whole shift in the vision of governance that has occurred.
Well, and I like what you said earlier, and I can't think of who else has been writing on this about the failure of our elites, educational elites, economic elites, political elites, to not preach what they practice is really strange to me. And again, this is a much longer conversation. I don't want us to go down this rabbit trail, or we'll be here forever. But why is it that in many instances, we know, for example, the data shows that married couples who attend church regularly, who have children, who have, where the parents are in the home, and all these things that supposedly are these carryovers from traditional society and patriarchy and whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's actually all good stuff, and yet they rail against it. And I don't, it's what is the underlying is it a psychological thing? Do they genuinely not see the value of their own, of these goods that they partake of, right? Is it just an ingratitude? Is it, what is going on there? Or is there something deeper where, sure, they may all be married, have kids, and stable jobs and families, yet they're still miserable? Okay, so what's going on there? There's a lot more that we could talk about. I don't want to delve too deep in there. I want to move to your concept of the social commons, because that's really important for what you're doing. I genuinely don't know the answer to this question. Are you you didn't invent this? You did not invent the idea of a commons, obviously, but the notion of a social commons, is this an Eleanor Ostrom idea? Is it, what do you mean by it?
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity that is definitely kind of the guiding conceptual sort of device and framework that I use. And yeah, no, I'm very much drawing from, that was kind of the original idea of the title I had for it, was governing the social commons, right? And it would be a direct riff on Eleanor Ostrom. She is she's a Nobel Prize winning political scientist, although she won the Nobel Prize in economics, and largely for her work on how communities govern themselves in terms of managing shared resource systems. So think of a lake that is shared by a community, a fishery, a forest, right? And the problem in that setting is, how does the community manage that shared resource system in a sustainable way, such that it is not depleted, and everybody suffers if the resource system is depleted too quickly and used in an unsustainable way. At the same time, every individual community member has an incentive to mismanage the resource, to overfish, or to implement deforestation too quickly, right, in an unsustainable way, because the gain to that individual person is concentrated, but the cost is widely distributed. And so that's the tragedy of the commons, right? So Eleanor Ostrom's whole point, and I think you can see how it relates to my analysis here, her whole argument in governing the commons is that, whereas a lot of people would argue that there's only two ways to solve this tragedy of the commons problem. You could either privatize the resource, carve it up, and try to implement some sort of privatization where we know that people have more incentive then to manage their own little plot, right, or their own little piece of the, quarter of the lake or whatever, in a sustainable way. That's not always possible to do. And so the other option would be Leviathan, right? This is the central planning mechanism, and that's going to establish centralized incentives, a common scheme of incentives, impose costs on proverbially overfishing, such that the community can manage things now in a sustainable way. Now, I think that, and I don't think I'm the first to suggest this, but I think this can have wider implications for a lot of social venues in which we interact with each other, right? That aren't necessarily best understood either in terms of a market or in terms of purely managed by a centralized governing force, right? So even you could think of, I mean, this is the favorite example of, legal scholars is like traffic. How do we manage traffic norms and traffic patterns? There's a role for law. I mean, but a lot of it is through, all right, what are they trying to signal to me? I'm trying to signal to them, right? How are we coming to terms with what each of us is trying to do, and how are we sharing the road? That's one example. The world of dating and family formation, to me, I think is another one we could think about as a commons, right? We all have expectations of each other that are more or less specified and clearly defined. And it's not something that anybody really sort of owns. You could think a lot of people analyze that domain of social life as a market, but I think we're generating norms of governance, and we are developing expectations of each other in a way that might be better thought of as a commons, right? Then you could think of just neighborhood life, right? As a sort of, we're building a shared social environment. And we have kind of spoken and unspoken rules about how we conduct ourselves and what happens when we violate those rules, right? We administer sanctions of various kinds. So that's kind of the vision there. To your question, there are other people who have used the term social commons, sometimes in a different way. And I note that, to talk more about global climate governance and sustainability governance. Seth Kaplan, who you mentioned, I actually saw, he wrote a piece in National Affairs. I honestly don't know, using this notion of the social commons. I don't know if I honestly didn't see that until after my book has been completed, and I was writing about this in Comment at the time, around the same time. So I'm not sure if either one of it, and we've met, and he came to speak at our conference and everything, and so I consider us to be laboring in similar fields.
Well, I'm still struggling a little bit to understand what you're saying, because. And again, I'm sure others share this. When I think of a commons, I'm having a hard time removing myself from tangible, like a resource-based idea, right? That there's something there's a physical thing to be managed, some kind of resource. Maybe it'll help to think of this. What is the tragedy of the social commons? Because It doesn't seem like because one of the things about the commons, especially from the environmental metaphors, especially, is the assumption of scarcity. So yes. Where does the scarcity show up in the social commons?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it may not be an exact one-to-one analogy. I think it's fair to say it's a kind of analogy, but where I do think there's still a tragedy involved is, you could think of it as, norms. How do norms come to be stable such that we can interact with each other in a way that we mutually understood expectations of each other, and they are mutually beneficial, right? To a great degree, right? And so think about the family formation, norm, right? Or the, hey, here's how we're going to organize ourselves in terms of what kind of sexual behavior is appropriate in our community, right? When is it illicit? When is it licit? And to me, where I think there is a tragedy of the social commons is that there is the dynamic of, hey, at any given time, when we have norms of various kinds related to that domain or some other domain, at any given time, each of us individually might face incentives or temptations, if you want to call them, to kind of free ride on the norm and expect that society is going to be operative in a way that provides for a sort of stable social experience and broadly beneficial social experience, while at the same time, we might in a particular instance have an opportunity to violate the norm, right? And so when enough people do that, the norm collapses because everybody knows this is not really a norm, right? That's followed, right? I am really not really doing anything that's actually different than from what most people do most of the time, right? And so that's kind of where I would think of it. I mean, I think of another, maybe a less freighted example of like, and this is maybe becoming obsolete with self-driving cars and all that. But the other example is, hey, back to traffic. We all want to live in a world where when we go out on the road, we can expect all the drivers around us not to be texting while they're driving, right? That's the stable social environment we want to operate in. But again, when I get that text, right? And oh man, maybe it's my wife, maybe it's, it's certainly something important when it's coming to me, right? And if we act on that incentive and take that opportunistic moment to kind of violate that norm that we're expecting everybody to live by, because it is conducive to building this sort of stable social architecture, we're contributing to kind of the unraveling of the social commons, if you will, or the deterioration of the social commons. And when that becomes, when we cannot expect certain behaviors of each other such that we have mutually beneficial expectations that are by and large followed, even if they're sometimes violated, right? Then the social commons can deteriorate, right? And I think that's some of what we're seeing.
Well, I wonder if another way to say that, I think I'm saying the same thing, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that in a way the common pool resource, to use the commons language, is essentially social capital and trust.
Yeah.
Is that part of it? And that the tragedy of the social commons is when those things, though you need to call them things is philosophically complicated, but the social capital and trust is itself, when it's either exploited or betrayed in some way or shape or form, the tragedy looks like distrust and cynicism. Essentially, this is one of the ways in which I think you can see this in the American context is one of the social goods, the social commons, is the idea of the rule of law. Yeah, I'm be honest. I mean, maybe you're not as cynical as I am, but the idea that the rich and the famous and the well-known get treated the same by the courts is just laughable to me, right? There's such a profound lack of accountability for many elites in the United States. That's a tragedy of the commons. We shared this norm. We shared this idea that, look, it doesn't matter who you are. If you break this law, you get in trouble, right? There's that famous study, you might have seen this, right, I think it's the 80s or 90s, where they ask kids in multiple developed countries, if the leader of your country, say it's the prime minister, a president, or a king, or whatever it was, between North America, Europe, South America, and Australia, I think they looked at. They said, if they were speeding, would they get a ticket? And American kids in the early 90s in particular overwhelmingly said, yeah, he would get a ticket. No one thinks that today, right? The idea that, I mean, obviously half the time the president, just being, driven by someone else, right? It's a little bit different, but it was the idea that the rule of law applied to all of us equally. Now we don't think that. The same might be true with the way economics works, the way the market works. I mean, I think that is that kind of what you're getting at, that these not just shared norms and shared expectations, shared trust. When it's betrayed or violated, or we become cynical and distrustful, and that's the tragedy of the social commons.
I think that's a really good way to capture it. There's a great one of the books that Ostrom cites is by I think a lesser known political scientist, Margaret Levy, I think is her name, and she has a book of Rule and Revenue. And it's about why do people pay taxes? Because enforcement capacity, we tend to think, is much lower than would be. Again, this is part of the whole point of the social commons idea too, is in general, mostly to produce a stable and beneficial social environment, law plays a role and enforcement of law plays an important role. But I think that the much larger role is managed through what social scientists call informal social control, right? How are persons formed and predisposed to behave, right? And how do our social sanctions incline us to behave, right? And what Levy points out is what people don't want is to feel like they're the only ones following the norm.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's like the worst way to put it. Like or the worst outcome is like, well, I'm sitting here being the sucker because I'm actually paying the taxes where everybody else is, evading. And that's when you can really see an unraveling of a kind of social order, because what's the point, right? And so you have to kind of try to find this, an equilibrium in which, there's some violators, and there's some violators who are known, but like most of the time we can expect most people to abide by the norm. Then that is more conducive to, again, like you said, building trust. The other thing I just would add too, though, is that, I mean, there also is the sort of like, I would say, the direct effect of like destructive norms or lack of norms. So for instance, the norm of, what used to be called shotgun marriage, or of, family formation, even if it's not in ideal circumstances, when, that being the proper forum for raising children, right? Where that has collapsed, I mean, that's, I think, had a profoundly destructive effect on, community life, and like you said, lack of father absence and things like that. And so there can also be like these direct effects of like when norms. So I think for or think about the norm broadly against divorce, right? That a divorce, except in the rarest of circumstances where churches, I think, kind of have backed away from actually trying to support that norm. Exactly. And I don't want to, I mean, there's all kinds of circumstances that comes up with that. And I understand that, but that can also we can have just like the loss of pro-social norms that in addition to like breeding distrust and everything, the loss of norms, there can be like direct destructive effects on community life, even if there are incentives for individuals, right, in any given circumstance where we can totally understand why that they would want we at different times might want to violate the norm, right?
Yeah. It's this feeling of, and I love, you said Margaret Levy. That was interesting. It made me think of, I was at Disney World a few months ago, and
I'm sorry.
I loved it. I kind of had this love-hate relationship with it. I mean, that's how a lot of, especially as a parent, when you go to Disney World, you're broke when you're done. But that's a whole nother episode. But I remember standing in line, and the number of people who cut in line, I mean, these long lines, or pretending that I have family up ahead. I went to the bathroom and I had to get to the, I wanted to trip them. I really did. Like I did not feel very Christian, but there is a sense in which, as we're raising our kids, we're saying you should play by the rules, but then they'll rightly look back and say, well, Dad, look at all these people not following the rules. No one is getting on their case. Why are you mad at me? Right. And I think there is, and again, when I say rules, I don't just mean laws. I don't just mean regulations. I mean, like you said, specific norms and expectations, that, again, like even, in our lifetime, right. Where, you said your grandpa, like, hey, if you get someone pregnant, you better, you can't just leave her. Right. And you're not married to her. You can't just, walk away. I mean, that's how I was raised. Right. It's like, look, there's no getting out of this. If I, made this, quote unquote, well, I would say mistake. I committed this sin. There's a consequence for that. That can also be, quite frankly, as we've known a lot of people who've done this, right? Who chose, I'm going to keep the child and I'm going to get married, and it worked out. Does it always? No, but at the same time, there is a sense in which we've lost that expectation, and those norms. Now I want to get to, there's two more areas I want to cover here. I want to get to this notion of place. So one of the ways that we, our themes, tradition, place, and things divine, we'll get to things divine next. Tradition is certainly a source of many of these norms, as your great grandfather, is an example here. But what about this notion of place? Like, is a sense of place, and in the social commons, intuitively I can see a connection, but it's a little bit harder to elaborate on. I don't know if you brought this up in the book, but did you see that as well?
Well, this is probably the place I'm weakest in. When we talk about our tradition and things divine, I'm like, yes, I'm super pumped, and then place I'm kind of like, but Seth Kaplan also, and actually I think he said this when he came and spoke, and my book hadn't come out yet, but we had talked about it a little bit, and he mentioned this at the end of his talk, so he thinks my ideas only will work in the context of a reinvigoration of local, place-based even neighborhood level efforts. Right. So on the one hand, yes, there's tons of important work on crime and on these kinds of social dysfunctions that we're kind of talking about that emphasize the role of place, right? And that if you look, I think his subtitle to his book has to do with like repairing American society,
zip code by zip code, yeah,
one zip code at a time, yeah,
yep.
And down to the neighborhood level, you can see. I mean, people have done interesting kinds of analyses of looking like, okay, one side of the tracks, and then the other side of the track, right? You could see just like a whole different social environment that is emerging, right? And even in Putnam's book, Our Kids, you see some of this. And, I do think that's hugely important. I mean, there's this sort of like emphasis on place and the built environment. One of the things that I should mention, another important scholar in this vein is Robert Sampson. He's a sociologist who really interesting scholar in kind of working on this territory and emphasizing the role of there are and in the literature on sort of crime and delinquency, there are these interesting studies of like showing enduring dynamics of place-based social dysfunction or, healthier kind of environments that are very much part of the discussion. Now, so I think that's unavoidably, like, we have to think about that. And there's actually a huge debate in the literature, and I don't know that I can say right now the like clear takeaways from it. There's a huge debate on like, let's say you have a situation of social dysfunction and it's just kind of like high levels of crime and social pathology and all these things in a neighborhood or a set of neighborhoods within a city. Should you try to revivify the place, or should you encourage people to the quote unquote moving to opportunity studies, right?
Yeah.
That have been done about, and I think they show some mixed results. There's kind of a debate on that, right? I mean, what's the right, if you're trying to raise a family in an environment that you think is not safe, that you think is deeply disordered, your kids are not going to have good opportunity. I mean, that seems to me a big tension, right? I mean, if you have an opportunity to kind of move to a place that is functioning and doing well and that allows opportunities for your kids, I mean, it's kind of hard for me to say don't do that. On the other hand, I do think a lot of the repair that, I mean, Seth has a huge point to make here, that like we need to start thinking about how are we contributing to our various particular local environments. And I think even those of us who are blessed to experience a lot of order and social opportunity in our lives and less social poverty are doing so in a way that, I mean, I think about even my wife and I moved into a home in northern Oklahoma City, a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I mean, most of our interactions are across the city, right? I mean, we go to church across the city. They're locally in our neighborhood. Now, we've tried to do some things, but I mean, there's a lot more we could do to try to like think about building community in our neighborhood. And I think a lot of us are like that. And again, it's so back to this social commons idea. We're like, man, nobody has good neighborhoods. Nobody cares about the neighborhood anymore. But how are we actually living our own lives, right? Especially those of us who are somehow connected to academia. We love to go to conferences all over the place, and I don't want to speak for everybody. I shouldn't speak for everybody, but maybe I'm projecting, right? Localism.
I might put it this way: is when you're talking about a social commons, a commons, just like when we're talking about in the economic sense, the environmental sense, it is never it's never it's not supposed to be, I should say, always an abstraction, right? It is a very specific commons. It's this lake, it's this river, it's this forest, it's this, just in the same way, there is a social commons that actually there's this would be another, to bring in like a John C. Calhoun, overlapping majorities, but also like there's overlapping social commons.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right word. but I think there is, in which if you don't have a sense of place, you lack a connection to that common. So here, let me give an example here. So I live in West Michigan, and if I struggle to connect to the people of this town in Holland where I live, I'm going to have less a sense of even what my obligations and duties and expectations are in that social commons. But there's certain things that, like, look, if there's certain expectations here, like, look, it's just understood that in Holland everyone gets divorced. Like, that's first of all, it's very much not true, but it's also like it would be a situation in which I would reject, right, that common pool norm, right? But at the same time, there might also be expectations, like, there's no official blue laws that I know of on the books here, but it's as if they follow them in at least in Holland, where I'm at. The same thing is true throughout Western Michigan, where a lot of businesses are just closed on Sundays, right? There used to be in Holland, there was this reputation where if you made the mistake of going out and mowing your lawn on a Sunday afternoon or something, your neighbor might yell at you, right? Because look, you need to be resting, right?
See, that's good. That's, social commons maintenance. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
I like mowing the lawn. That's the thing. It's like, this is how I spend my Sabbath. Now, again, what I'm trying to say is that place, like tradition, is a source of these common norms and ideas and expectations and trust, etc. It may be a good thing or a bad thing, right? There's certainly some places where this is where the norm might have been racism, right? That's not what we want. And so I think as we lose a sense and a connection to that place, we're losing another set of norms. The other thing is this sense in which we import commons external to our place into our place. So the idea is, this makes me think of the whole notion that all politics is local, which I don't think is true anymore. I think, thanks to mass media and the internet, all politics is national, unfortunately, in the sense that, why does my city councilman's position on abortion matter? Now, obviously I'm deeply pro-life, but nothing this city councilman does is going to impact, I don't think, abortion in my town, right? So why would that even matter? Or again, those are there might be a state level political issue, or I don't care what my county commissioner thinks about Iran. Like, could be less. It's just profoundly irrelevant, I think. Maybe I'm wrong there, but I think there is a sense in which, I'll put it this way again. Also, let's say your primary formation is online and you're interacting with people in other places all the time. Do you know how to even interact with your neighbors? Right? Do you even know what the expectations are when you talk to them, the people that have lived here for a long time? I think that's, I'm facing that myself. It's still, I've been here for 4 years now. There's this always the saying in West Michigan, if you're not Dutch, you ain't much. And there's
heard that.
I'm still trying to figure out what is, I'm not Dutch and I have nothing against the Dutch. I'm just trying to figure out what the heck does it mean to be Dutch? I think as far as I've gotten so far is you don't talk as loud as my Italian self. And the spiciest your food gets is with pepper. It's the joke is it's Dutch hot sauce. Like, these people, these in your food. There's more to life than pepper. So you live in Texas, you understand. So
that's right.
Well, we don't have a ton of time left, but we have about 20 minutes ish. I want to get to a point that's near and dear to the book and to both of our hearts, and that is the role of the church, both in the sense of diagnosing what you're looking at and in the prescription. So how does the church fit into your overall project here?
Yes. I have a chapter that I called, and this is kind of something I've been thinking about for a while, which is the social witness of the Christian church. And, you mentioned something a few minutes ago. There's this odd dynamic that I do. You hit on exactly that I'm trying to highlight, that we know, I think, intuitively, and then there's lots of and increasingly high quality social science research backing up the idea that you said, that a lot of things like people who are married tend to express higher levels of happiness or contentment in life. People who attend church, on a weekly basis tend to express higher levels than those that don't of, general well-being and, contentment and mental health well-being and things like that. Right. I mean, there's all these things that we kind of know. And yet increasing numbers of us in society are not, sort of, to put it crassly, availing ourselves of these opportunities, right? To be involved in faith, family, and community. I call it a kind of spiritual foot binding, right? And foot binding was a practice in China for 1,000 years, right? Which is where this was a practice where parents would bind the feet of their daughters so that they didn't grow to be beyond a certain size. They basically folded their feet over. It's a barbaric practice, right? And there's lots of evidence that people didn't like doing it. It's not as if parents were excited to do this to their children, right? It became a norm, right? It became an expectation that if you wanted to have wanted to be able to marry your daughter off, right, then that would be the expectation, that her feet would be bound. And I think there's an interesting story about how it collapsed that plays into my argument. But spiritual foot binding, I think that's kind of similar to what we're doing, right? I mean, we're not everyone. Lots of people are experiencing loneliness, are experiencing difficulty with establishing committed and nourishing relationships. And there are very clear sort of ways to address this, right? And I do think the church plays the predominant, the central role in this, right? So in that chapter, what I try to do is talk about the early rise of the church based on the work of historians and sociologists like Robert Louis Wilkin and Rodney Stark, for example. And what they narrate is a story of the church prior to coming into kind of civil political power in the 300s. They narrate this story of the church rising as a social force, right? Offering a social witness to a different kind of life in a situation. This was church largely was an urban movement, right? And this was in a situation of cities that were experiencing not exactly the same problems we're experiencing, but urban problems, right? And also even different forms of life and a manner of life that was in some ways very cruel and harsh, especially to women and especially, to unwanted babies. And the church offered something different, right? And also there were, Stark talks about times of plague where the members of the church showed themselves to, of course, be supportive of each other, but even also to be sacrificially supportive of people outside of the church and willing to care for them. And so that's what I wanted to highlight as, and I think you could think of it as this kind of massive, what I call it is a convention account of the church. One aspect of the church, not the only aspect, one aspect of the church is that you could think of it as offering a whole manner of life, right? A convention, if you will, a social convention that, or a set of conventions, like, for instance, that recognizes, hey, we need to regularly confess our sins to each other, right? We understand that we aren't perfect and we are sinful. We're in need of God's grace. We need to confess our sins to each other. We need to be restored back into the good graces of the community through the power of the Holy Spirit. We need to be accountable to each other for our moral behavior and conduct. We need to be welcoming to people of all classes, right? I mean, there's just all these different ways you could think of the church as offering a set of norms. We're going to not have abortion or infanticide in our communities, right? We're going to offer something different. Our marriages need to be different, similar in some ways, but different than the marriage, the typical Roman marriage, right? I mean, all these ways that it was a counter set of conventions running, or even a culture. Robert Louis Wilkin describes it as itself a culture, right? And I think we need to channel that kind of ethos today and to think of the church in a much more rich, robust way than the place we go Sunday and Wednesday night, maybe, right? To kind of get a midweek boost. I mean, we're talking about the formation of a social commons, if you will, right? And trying to bolster that kind of attitude of the church as a life-giving, grace-filled set of conventions that recognizes our fallenness and our need to govern ourselves and to be equipped to govern ourselves, but also needs grace for restoration when we fall.
Do you think I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I can hear someone saying like, yeah, come to my church, right? It doesn't sound like anything. Or why don't you go to the church I left, right? You know, kind of thing. There's this sense in which it feels too optimistic. And again, I'm on your side here, but let's imagine someone in that position, because one of the challenges that has happened in the last, especially in the United States in the last, I say 80 years, is this hollowing out of a more comprehensive ecclesiology, right? In the sense that our sense of what church is, or what it's supposed to be, what it aspires to be, has actually been either corrupted or betrayed, but also just diminished, become more superficial. To what extent is the church's failure to be the church part of the tragedy of the social commons? I mean, am I taking it too far? What do you think about that thought?
No, I 100% agree with that. I mean, and there's all kinds of factors that I think that have contributed to the decline of especially the mainline churches in the United States. I do think in some ways part of the decline is the failure to recognize that the church failure to recognize on the part of both leaders and lay people about what is the church, right? It is not simply a kind of social club. Yeah, it's not. And again, I'm not saying anything new in that, except to maybe try to get us to think about it in terms of this social commons, social convention kind of dynamic that we ought to be. I do think that's a big part of it, right? And in many cases, churches, of course, have basically capitulated to changing social norms outside of our context. So, I mean, Tim Keller actually had a nice report on this, where he cites people like Mencken talking about the religion of liberalism and how it's become infused into the churches. And I think a lot of times what we've done is sort of absorbed the broader norms from outside the culture, from the culture around us. Partly because, I mean, it's an interesting thing. This gets into the whole debate on liberalism and post-liberalism, right? And what you said about James Patterson talking about, has the church failed, liberalism, right? I mean, in some ways the church itself, the fact that the church was one of the predominant institutions in the United States, I think the churches may have come to kind of rely overly, and Jim Rogers has a great analysis on this in a few places. He's a political scientist at Texas A&M, but where the idea was, hey, the public norms around us are basically synonymous with what the church is teaching. And so we kind of relaxed our sense of ourselves as the church as offering something, a distinctive set of conventions and way of life, responsible to inculcate and guard that among our members and encourage it. And so in some ways, there's a kind of free riding that I think may have also contributed to this loss of our ability to to properly construe in our minds and hearts, and then ultimately our behaviors, what the church is, how we ought to engage as members of the church, members of the body of Christ. So I do think that so that's, I think, a whole set of issues. And then also, add to that, I mean, the failures where there has been serious abuses on the part of church leaders and church authorities. That certainly is a big problem, right? I mean, and to the need to reclaim warranted trust is a big hill to climb, right? How do we rebuild that?
But I also think there's a level of hope in thinking about this. And here's what I mean. Going back to the we'll call it a more materialistic or economic sense of the commons. I live on the Great Lakes. If the Great Lakes have been mismanaged for a century at least, and I can't offer you a new Great Lake, right? If we screw this up, it could very likely be screwed up forever. A tragedy of the social commons is different, I think, because while it could be very, very devastating and dramatic, there is a sense in which the church can offer, like, look, there's a tragedy of this social commons over here in the American context in the community. Here's another social commons, right, that is not disconnected from tradition, place, or the world outside, but entirely. But it's also an partake of this social commons, join this one, and there's a lot here. The other thing too is, I mean, the church, of course, has the benefit of the Holy Spirit to hold it together and to make this work. And yes, the church, the church fails. I mean, I'm a sinner. I'm part of that failure at times. But I do think the church rightly conceived, and again, what does that mean? Rightly conceived. We should have more debates about that, right? Especially as a Ciceronian society with all the different denominations. But I think there's something there where that you're giving us hope by framing it as a social commons, because it means we're not just at the mercy of all the. I mean, it's not like a environmental commons could be destroyed for you just by nature, just by diseases you can't control, by a hurricane, by a flood or a bad winter. There's that's not the case here when it comes to the social commons of the church. There is always hope, because we are humans made in the image of God. The Holy Spirit has not abandoned us, never will. And so therefore, that's there. Yeah, there's hope there. So just some final thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, think of the passage in Matthew 18, which is in some ways a kind of social commonsy passage, right, where he's talking about governance in the church, right? How do you deal with conflict and with sin in the church? And that's one of where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I among them, right? I mean, and so yes, I really hadn't thought of that point in those terms. But I appreciate that point a lot. And I am my last chapter is called Sanctuaries of Hope, right? I do think it's so easy for us to focus on what's not working well in society. And I'm maybe adding to that, but at the same time, I do think that that's exactly right. There's all kinds of, I think there are places we can find all over the country, and people who are building, covenantally framed church and other religious communities, right? Mm-hmm. Who are building, the more thick kind of social commons, reviving local neighborhoods in a way that should give us hope. And I try to highlight a few of those examples, but I definitely just want to underscore that point with the church, right? We trust in God's providence, and we do seek to be part of what God is doing, and we can trust that He will. The gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. That is a promise we can hold to tightly.
Absolutely. All right, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation. I was really excited to talk to you. Really enjoy the conversation, and look forward to discussing these things more.
Yeah, man. All right. Well, I hope to see you at the fall event or the spring event. Of course, we will see each other at whatever the next board meeting is. So I really appreciate your help and your contribution to the Ciceronian Society. It's been great. All right, you've been listening to the Sower a production of the Ciceronian Society. And as a reminder, we have a second podcast discussing Cicero's seminal work On Duties that is released every Wednesday morning. Be sure to take a look at that one as well. We also have the Fall Symposium, Spring Conference, not to mention our Journal Pietas, the annual Herbert Storing Prize, the new Logres Institute, and much more. Make sure to sign up for our newsletter to stay on top of everything involving the Ciceronian Society. Don't forget to rate and review this podcast, share it with your friends, check out our website at ciceroniansociety.org, and thank you for listening.